They thought he would stay silent, that in front of cameras, under pressure, with the whole world watching, he'd fold. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't blink. He stood firm, stared into the lens, and said what no African leader had ever dared to say to a former American president. But before we continue, make sure you subscribe to this channel, a channel that stands with Ibrahim Traoré and the rise of a new Africa. What happened next didn't just shake the room, it shook the balance of global power. And if you think this is just politics, think again. This was personal, this was history. This was a moment no one could unsee. Because Traoré didn't just reject a deal, he rewrote the future. The air inside the conference hall was thick with tension. Reporters shifted in their seats, officials whispered behind folders, and camera crews locked their lenses on the stage. Everyone was waiting for the handshake, the symbolic gesture that would mark a new beginning between Africa and the West. At the center of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré, calm, composed, his eyes scanning the room like a soldier on the battlefield. Barack Obama, invited as a global envoy for diplomacy, had just delivered a well-crafted speech. His words painted visions of unity, investment, and collaboration. But beneath the polished promises, there was something else, a carefully wrapped proposal that came with invisible strings, a deal meant to look like help but feel like control. And Traoré saw it for exactly what it was. The deal promised millions in development aid, new military training programs, and strategic cooperation between Africa and Western partners. It sounded generous, it sounded diplomatic, but to Traoré, it sounded like a leash, one that would slowly tighten around Burkina Faso's sovereignty, disguised as partnership. He had read between the lines, and he wasn't impressed. As applause died down, a well-dressed aide approached Traoré with a tablet. On the screen, the official document. All it needed was his signature. The cameras zoomed in. Microphones picked up the faint sound of rustling paper. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for. But something unexpected happened. Traoré didn't move. He looked at the document for a full 10 seconds, not blinking. Then, slowly, he placed the tablet back on the table. He reached for the microphone instead. The room went dead silent. Even Obama leaned forward slightly, sensing that something was about to break the script. And in that moment, the world held its breath. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. But his words hit harder than any headline. He thanked Obama for the proposal, then said he would have to decline. Not because Burkina Faso didn't need allies, but because his people would no longer trade their dignity for deals made behind closed doors. Africa will rise, he said, but on its own feet. Gasps filled the hall. The Western envoys looked stunned. Even the interpreters hesitated before repeating his words. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a declaration. A line drawn boldly in front of every global power that had ever tried to own a piece of Africa's future. And Traoré had just made history live on air. As the cameras continued rolling, Ibrahim Traoré stepped away from the podium, his silence louder than applause. He was not trying to provoke, he was not seeking confrontation, but his rejection had exposed something far deeper. The hidden expectations the world had placed on African leaders for decades. Expectations to obey, to comply, to be grateful for whatever was handed to them. That day, Traoré shattered that mold. Backstage, whispers turned into frantic phone calls. Journalists raced to rewrite their headlines. Advisors from multiple countries scrambled to spin the moment into something less damaging. But the truth was already echoing across the globe. Traoré had not just said no, he had reminded the world that Africa no longer needed permission to think for itself. And millions watching at home understood the message. Social media platforms lit up within minutes. Clips of the rejection were posted, translated and shared in nearly every language. In Ouagadougou, spontaneous cheers erupted in cafes and university halls. Young men and women saw something in Traoré's stance that they had been waiting for their entire lives. A leader who did not bow, who did not flinch, who made no excuses for putting his people first. Across the Atlantic, responses were divided. Some commentators praised Traoré's courage, calling it a defining moment for African independence. Others accused him of arrogance, of turning down an opportunity for progress. But no one could deny what had happened. In less than 5 minutes, a former American president had been publicly outmaneuvered by a Burkinabe soldier-turned-leader, with the entire world watching. Inside the conference hall, Obama remained composed, but his eyes said more than his smile. He knew what this moment meant. It was not just about one deal, it was about a shift in power, a shift in narrative, a shift in who gets to lead the conversation. And for perhaps the first time in his diplomatic career, he had been caught off guard, not by aggression, but by principle. As Traoré exited the stage, he did not look back. There were no triumphant gestures, no self-congratulations, only the quiet confidence of a man who had said what needed to be said. His security team formed a loose circle around him, but no one dared stop him for questions. The message had been clear. The moment had passed. History had already recorded it. Outside the building, a light rain began to fall. Traoré walked through it without an umbrella. Journalists watched from behind. The glass as he moved toward his vehicle. His uniform slightly damp, his posture unwavering. There was something symbolic in that walk, as if the storm had come, and Traoré had chosen to face it head-on, unprotected, unafraid, and untouched. That evening, the streets of Ouagadougou pulsed with energy. People gathered around radios and television sets, some standing in silence, others clapping with restrained pride. Markets closed early. Flags appeared in windows. There was no official celebration, but the feeling in the air was unmistakable. Something had changed. Ibrahim Traoré had done more than speak. He had redefined what leadership could look like. In villages far from the capital, elders sat in circles, nodding slowly as they listened to the news. These were men and women who had seen generations of promises, treaties, and foreign visits. But they had never seen one of their own speak with such conviction in front of the world and refuse the bait so many before him had accepted. To them, Traoré was not just a soldier. He had become a symbol of restoration. Across the continent, reactions varied. In West Africa, leaders exchanged messages behind encrypted lines, some anxious, others inspired. Would their own people start demanding more? Would they be expected to take similar stands? The ripple effect was undeniable. One rejection had become a mirror, forcing nations to reflect on their own compromises, their own silence, and what it would cost them to find their voice again. In Western capitals, diplomats held closed-door meetings well into the night. The deal had been carefully negotiated. Months of preparation, endless calls, private assurances, all gone in seconds. And now they had a viral moment they could not control. Ibrahim Traoré had made them appear weak, unprepared, and most dangerously irrelevant. The question now was not how to retaliate, but how to recalibrate. Inside his residence, Traoré remained focused. He did not celebrate. He did not tweet. He spent the evening in briefings with his military council, reviewing regional updates, checking in on local development projects. While the world discussed him, he kept his attention on the ground, on the farmers, the teachers, the children, the people who had always mattered more than diplomacy or applause. His closest advisors knew what was coming. The backlash would be quiet at first, pressure through aid delays, visa restrictions, and veiled warnings from international partners. But Traoré had already accepted that. He had prepared Burkina Faso for the storm. What he wanted was not approval. What he wanted was respect, and he knew it would never be given freely. It had to be claimed. Later that night, he stepped out, into the courtyard alone. The sky above was clear again, the earlier rain gone. He stood there for a long time, hands behind his back, eyes toward the stars. Perhaps he was thinking of the risks ahead, or perhaps he was simply breathing the night air of a country that, for the first time in a long while, felt truly sovereign. By the next morning, headlines had spread across every continent. African leader defies the West. Traoré says no to Obama. A new voice in global politics. But no article captured the true weight of what had happened. They spoke of politics, of diplomacy, of shifting alliances, but what they missed was the heartbeat behind the moment. This was not just news. It was a warning, a promise, and a revelation, all in one. In Washington, analysts were stunned. How could a relatively young leader from a small nation take control of a live international stage and reshape the conversation so completely? They replayed the footage, searching for signs of rehearsed defiance, signs of external influence. But there was none. What they saw, over and over, was a man who meant every word, and that made him dangerous, not because of weapons, but because of truth. Obama, now back in his hotel suite, remained silent. His team issued a carefully worded statement, emphasizing mutual respect and continued dialogue. But insiders revealed a different picture. He was frustrated, not by the rejection itself, but by how skillfully Traore had turned the narrative. It was supposed to be a gesture of goodwill. Instead, it had become a global reminder that Africa was no longer asking, it was deciding. In Burkina Faso, local radio hosts played clips of Traore's speech every hour. Children recited his words in classrooms. Community leaders used them to start conversations about dignity, ownership, and the long road ahead. For a nation that had long lived under the weight of foreign influence, this moment was fuel. It gave people permission to dream again, not as subjects of aid, but as architects of their own future. Meanwhile, foreign ambassadors requested urgent meetings with Traore's ministers. Some came with softened tones, offering revised agreements and open dialogue. Others came with pressure, hinting at consequences for stepping out of line. But Burkina Faso's stance remained unchanged. If cooperation was to continue, it would be on equal terms, not beneath the table, not behind closed doors, and never again at the cost of self-respect. Traore's refusal to play the old game had triggered something bigger than he anticipated. Young Africans across the continent took to social media with renewed confidence. They created art, wrote poems, organized discussions in universities. His act of resistance had become contagious. It had awakened a generation that had grown tired of speeches and hungry for action. And that, more than any deal, was the real shift. In quiet villages, where electricity was scarce but hope still flickered, elders smiled as they heard the story. They had seen colonizers come and go. They had watched as flags changed, but systems stayed the same. But now, they witnessed something different. A son of the soil had looked the world in the eye and said, "We are no longer afraid." And that single sentence, though spoken without thunder, had shaken the foundations of power. Inside African embassies abroad, ambassadors walked with a new posture. For years they had spoken cautiously, measuring every word to avoid upsetting larger powers. But now, with Ibrahim Traoré's words still echoing across the globe, they found themselves speaking with quiet certainty. They were no longer just diplomats. They were messengers of a continent rediscovering its voice. And the tone of their conversations was changing. In France, officials at the Foreign Ministry debated how to respond. The country had long considered West Africa part of its strategic sphere, maintaining military bases, business contracts, and cultural influence. But Traoré's stand had disrupted that balance. It was not the military that threatened France's position. It was the narrative. If one African nation could reject the old terms, others might follow. And if that happened, the entire structure could crumble. In media circles, debate erupted. Was Traoré reckless or visionary? Had he isolated his country or elevated it? Commentators clashed on television screens, each trying to explain his motives. But what they missed was the simplest truth of all. He had nothing to prove. His rejection was not a performance, it was a line drawn out of principle, and that clarity, that refusal to play politics with people's future, was what made it unforgettable. Back in Ouagadougou, schools began organizing debates around the speech. Students dissected every sentence, analyzing the meaning, tone, and consequences. For the first time, a presidential address was not just about policy, it was about identity. Teachers noticed a shift in how their students spoke. There was more confidence, more curiosity, more pride. Traoré had not just led a nation, he had inspired a generation to think differently. In neighboring countries, leaders watched closely. Some applauded Traoré in private, but hesitated to do so publicly. They feared backlash, they feared losing aid, they feared what their own citizens might begin to demand. But deep down, many of them understood that the old script no longer worked. The world had seen what it looked like when an African leader spoke without fear. And that image was not easy to erase. At night, in homes across Burkina Faso, families gathered to talk. Fathers spoke of dignity, mothers spoke of sacrifice, sons and daughters spoke of possibility. It was rare for politics to touch so many lives so deeply. But this was not about policies. It was about being seen, being heard, and being respected. And for once, those things did not feel like distant dreams. They felt real, close, and within reach. Somewhere in the capital, Traore reviewed letters from citizens, handwritten notes, drawings from children, prayers from elders. He read them quietly, one by one, without cameras or advisors. And though he said little, those around him noticed the shift. He carried the weight of a people who had finally found their voice, and he was determined never to let it be silenced again. While the international press speculated about political fallout, Ibrahim Traoré's focus remained unchanged. He was not interested in headlines or public image. He was interested in results. Inside the presidential compound, he spent hours reviewing reports on local farming cooperatives, road repairs, and education initiatives. For him, the real statement was not in what he rejected, but in what he built afterward. Advisors urged him to issue clarifications, to soften the blow, to reassure the West that cooperation was still possible. But Traoré knew that truth did not need editing. His message had already been heard, and more importantly, it had been understood. What mattered now was not managing perception, it was proving that Burkina Faso could thrive without bending. International organizations responded with predictable caution. Some paused funding agreements, others postponed meetings. Behind these moves was a clear message. Independence had consequences. But Traoré had prepared for this moment. He had spent months building new alliances across the continent and beyond, knowing that true sovereignty required self-reliance, and that rejection of the old order came with a price. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, ministers began citing Traoré's speech in their own internal meetings. The phrase, "we must no longer beg," started appearing in national discussions. Something deep was shifting beneath the surface. The speech had not ended with applause. It had planted seeds. And now those seeds were beginning to grow in places where silence had long taken root. Western think tanks released papers overnight. Some called Traoré a populist. Others called him a radical. But buried in their analysis was a note of fear. Fear that the balance of power was slipping, not through war or rebellion, but through clarity, through a refusal to participate in the theater of diplomacy without dignity. And that fear meant one thing: the system had been exposed. Inside, a modest rural clinic in northern Burkina Faso, a nurse listened to the replay of the speech on her radio. She smiled gently, not because of politics, but because she felt something shift in her spirit. She had given her life to service, often with little recognition, but now she felt represented. Her daily sacrifices, her quiet strength, it had a voice on the global stage, and it made her stand a little taller. As dusk settled across the land, Traoré walked through the gardens of the presidential residence. The night air was cool, filled with the scent of earth and flowering trees. He stopped briefly to look at the stars, his hands clasped behind his back. He knew storms would come, but he also knew something deeper. The sky above belonged to no empire, and neither did his country. The days that followed were anything but quiet. Analysts tried to predict Traoré's next move, while officials in foreign capitals watched Burkina Faso's every announcement with growing unease. But Traoré did not play their game. Instead of issuing statements or engaging in debates, he focused on actions. He launched infrastructure projects in rural regions. He visited schools without notice. He made himself visible not to the world, but to his people. In a small farming village, a local elder gathered his community under a large baobab tree. With a transistor radio perched on a wooden bench, he replayed Traoré's words once more. Children sat wide-eyed, listening, mothers stirred pots of maize porridge nearby. And with every word, something unspoken passed between them, the realization that they were no longer on the sidelines of history. Across the continent, artists began painting murals of Traore standing tall in front of a storm. Poets composed verses about dignity reclaimed. Musicians turned his speech into rhythm and song. What had started as a political moment had become cultural, a shared experience, a new language of pride that reached far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. Inside Western media circles, some voices tried to discredit the moment. They called it a stunt. They questioned his education, his background, his intentions. But the more they tried to diminish him, the more he grew in the eyes of those who had long been unseen. Traore's power came not from power itself, but from connection, from speaking plainly and from standing where others had once bowed. In boardrooms in Brussels and New York, executives discussed risk assessments. Was the region becoming unstable? Would contracts be honored? Would new leaders follow Traore's example? But what they failed to understand was this. The instability they feared was not born from chaos. It was born from awakening, from people beginning to realize that they were worth more than what they had been offered. Meanwhile, Traore continued to walk a quiet path. He held community town halls without cameras. He sat in circles with youth leaders, listening more than speaking. His leadership did not demand attention, it invited trust. He knew that transformation did not happen in headlines. It happened in the daily decisions of people who believed that something better was possible. At sunrise, a group of young students gathered near the university gates in Ouagadougou. They painted a large banner with a quote from the speech. "We do not reject the world. We reject the conditions placed upon our dignity." They hung it high where everyone could see, and as the morning light passed through it, the red, green, and gold of their flag shimmered softly, a reminder that something powerful had begun and it would not be undone. In the following days, a wave of invitations flooded Ibrahim Traoré's office. Media outlets from around the world requested exclusive interviews. Foreign think tanks proposed roundtables. Even universities from Europe and North America asked him to speak to their students. But Traoré declined them all. He was not interested in applause from afar. His focus remained firmly rooted in the soil of Burkina Faso. While international attention surged, something else was quietly unfolding. Communities once divided by fear or fatigue began to unite. In mining towns, workers organized forums to discuss local ownership. In desert villages, elders and youth collaborated on water access projects. It was as if Traoré's rejection had awakened more than just pride. It had sparked responsibility. The message had landed. If we are truly free, we must also act like it. At the African Union headquarters, conversations became tense. Some leaders feared the precedent Traoré had set. Others privately applauded it, but hesitated to speak up. The organization found itself at a crossroads: cling to diplomatic neutrality or embrace the wave of renewed sovereignty washing over the continent. And though Traoré never demanded their approval, his silence challenged them to choose a side. In Washington, internal reports revealed a troubling truth for policymakers. Traoré's popularity was rising not only in Africa, but among diaspora communities worldwide. Young African Americans, European Africans, and Caribbean thinkers began citing him as a symbol of modern resistance. They shared clips of his speech with captions like, "This is leadership, and we deserve voices like this." And in that reflection, old powers saw the beginning of a cultural shift they could not control. Inside the compound, Traoré's team stayed focused. Logistics, development, national security, every area required sharp attention. And yet, they worked with a new energy, driven by the belief that their mission was larger than governance. They were not just managing a country, they were defending a vision. And that vision required consistency, humility, and above all, courage. Meanwhile, in a dusty schoolhouse on the outskirts of Bobo-Dioulasso, a 10-year-old girl stood up during a writing assignment. The prompt was simple: write about someone who inspires you. She began her page with one sentence: "My president did not bow to anyone." Her teacher paused when she read it, then wiped her glasses and smiled. Something was changing, not in government buildings but in hearts. At twilight, as the sun sank behind the Sahel horizon, Traoré stood once more on the roof of the residence. Below, the lights of Ouagadougou flickered to life, soft and steady. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening, not to noise but to silence, the kind of silence that comes after speaking a hard truth, the kind that echoes not through microphones but through history. As governments recalibrated and analysts debated, the people of Burkina Faso kept moving forward. Traoré's speech had not magically solved their challenges. Poverty still lingered. Resources were still limited. But something had shifted. The weight of silence had lifted. And with that, a new kind of hope took root. Not the fragile hope born from foreign aid, but the durable kind that grows from within. In the northern provinces, volunteers organized mobile clinics. In the south, young entrepreneurs opened cooperatives using local materials and labor. The change was not commanded, it was inspired. No decree could create what was now spreading across the land. Belief. A belief that they no longer had to wait for approval, for permission or for rescue. They were not a project. They were a people. And their leader had reminded them of that. Traoré continued to walk among them quietly. No motorcades, no rehearsed speeches. Just his presence, firm, calm, human. He listened to market vendors, to herders, to nurses. He asked what they needed, what they dreamed of, and what they feared. And in those small moments, he did something few leaders ever managed to do. He made them feel seen, not just as citizens, but as the very soul of the nation. In international circles, the silence around the rejected deal began to crack. Some former officials admitted, off record, that the proposal had included clauses that compromised Burkina Faso's autonomy. Others confessed that they had underestimated Traoré's resolve, but none dared admit the deeper truth, that they had built entire systems on the assumption that no one would ever say no. On the streets of Nairobi, Dakar and Accra, murals of Traoré appeared overnight. His image painted next to slogans like, "We stand tall," and "Dignity has no price." These were not cults of personality. They were reflections of a continent yearning for a new standard. A standard where courage outweighed convenience, where leadership meant standing in truth, even when it came with consequences. Meanwhile, young African scholars began writing essays and recording podcasts inspired by the event. They spoke not only of politics, but of identity, history, and possibility. They challenged colonial narratives and redefined what it meant to lead. Traoré had not asked to be their symbol, but by refusing to bend, he had become one. That night, under a sky blanketed with stars, Traoré walked alone through the presidential gardens. No guards, no lights, just footsteps on dry earth. Somewhere deep in the distance, a drum echoed faintly. Perhaps from a celebration, perhaps from a prayer. And as he listened, he whispered only one thing to himself: let the people keep rising. By the end of the week, it was no longer just a national moment. It had become a continental echo. Across Africa, university halls buzzed with debate. Young leaders quoted Traoré in student forums. Professors adjusted their lectures to include the speech as a case study in modern diplomacy. And in online forums, thousands shared one sentiment again and again: this is the beginning of something bigger. Western policymakers tried to regain the narrative. They sent new envoys, softened their tone, promised listening tours, and restructured dialogue, but the tone had already changed. The illusion that African leaders needed to be managed or persuaded had cracked, and once a crack appears in the glass, it only takes time before the whole pane falls away. What was once unspoken had now been declared. Africa would speak for itself. In the heart of Burkina Faso, farmers noticed a new energy among the youth. Sons and daughters who once dreamed only of leaving now spoke of staying. They talked of land, of building, of creating something lasting. This was not propaganda, it was personal. The leader on television had not promised them riches. He had promised them something far more valuable: the right to decide their own future. Inside the presidential compound, Traoré received updates from rural regions. Roads were being paved, wells were being repaired, Clinics were reporting better attendance. The changes were small, but they were real, and for Traoré, each one was a step toward a vision that could not be bought or borrowed. Their vision built on trust, self-worth, and quiet resolve. His ministers began to notice something unusual. International partners who once made demands now asked questions. Instead of telling Burkina Faso what was needed, they listened. Meetings began with respect, not assumptions. Traoré had not made the country richer in gold or oil, but he had made it richer in principle, and that currency, though invisible, commanded attention. At a school assembly in Koudougou, a young boy stood in front of his classmates and recited a poem he had written. It ended with a line that brought the crowd to their feet. They offered us chains with golden locks. We chose the key instead. The applause was thunderous. Teachers wiped their eyes. And somewhere, miles away, a quiet president continued reading handwritten letters from his people. As dusk returned and the sky dimmed into deep violet, Traoré sat by an open window, watching the wind stir through the trees. No advisors, no noise. Just him and the soft rhythm of a nation rediscovering its heart. The world had tried to give him a script. He had chosen to write his own. And through that choice, he gave others permission to do the same. As more days passed, it became clear that this was not a passing moment. It was a shift, slow, steady, and irreversible. Across Burkina Faso, people no longer waited for the future to arrive. They began building it with their own hands. Women's cooperatives expanded in remote towns. Local engineers proposed innovative farming techniques. Artists turned public spaces into walls of color and pride. It was a quiet revolution, not of weapons but of will. At the heart of it all, Ibrahim Traoré remained almost invisible to the outside world. He declined interviews, avoided fanfare, and rarely appeared on camera. But within his country, he was everywhere. In community centers, at border checkpoints, walking through hospitals unannounced. His leadership style was not one of grand speeches. It was one of presence. And that, more than any policy, created trust. The rejected deal, once seen as a blow to progress, now appeared in a different light. Analysts who had called Traoré short-sighted began revising their assessments. International observers admitted that he had exposed flaws in the system, not through rebellion, but through restraint. He had not insulted anyone. He had simply refused to sell what could not be bought, the dignity of his nation. In small cafes in Lagos and Kampala, young professionals discussed the speech over coffee. They spoke of the burden of being always seen as dependent, of their own frustration with the global gaze. Traoré had voiced what many had long felt, but could never articulate. That rejection was not defiance, it was healing. A way to reclaim what had been slowly eroded by decades of deals made in someone else's interest. In New York, a documentary filmmaker began compiling footage for a film titled The Silence That Spoke. It opened with the moment Traoré placed the tablet back on the table and reached for the microphone. The image was simple, but it carried more weight than any explosion or uprising. It was a man choosing his people over applause, and that choice had become iconic. Meanwhile, in a dusty courtyard outside a primary school, a girl wrote the president's name in chalk on the wall. Her spelling was imperfect, but her intention was clear. She had seen his face on television, heard her parents speak of his words, and felt that she too mattered. In that moment, leadership was no longer distant. It had a face, a voice, a name, and it belonged to her people. That evening, Traoré met with a small group of elders. No photographers, no press, just conversation. They shared stories of past betrayals, of resilience, of rebuilding. When the meeting ended, one elder placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You speak like us, not above us." And in that one sentence, the journey of a nation found its meaning, the power of rising not through dominance, but through understanding. As global attention gradually shifted elsewhere, the impact of Ibrahim Traoré's stand continued to deepen at home. What had started as a single act of refusal had matured into a national mindset. Across the country, people began challenging old habits. Civil servants refused bribes, Teachers returned to underfunded classrooms with new purpose, and in every region, the phrase, "We stand with Traore," began to mean something real, not loyalty to a man, but commitment to a vision. In private meetings, regional leaders began asking themselves difficult questions. Could they replicate this kind of leadership? Would their people demand it? Some feared the answer, others welcomed it. But no one could deny that Traore had reset the scale. No longer was leadership measured by foreign approval. It was measured by proximity to the people and the courage to tell uncomfortable truths, even when no one applauded. International conferences shifted their tone. African nations began entering negotiations with firmer language, clearer terms, and less hesitation. They cited Burkina Faso's example not as a rebellion, but as a recalibration. It was no longer about rejection. It was about restoration, of agency, of pride, of balance. And even those who opposed Traoré privately admitted it had worked. Because power, when exercised with humility, leaves a mark. In one rural community, a local radio host ended every broadcast with the same sentence. "We were never poor, we were always rich, much in soul, in story, in strength. And now the world sees it too." Listeners tuned in daily, not for news alone, but for dignity. Traoré had not just inspired action, he had redefined what it meant to be seen without shame. Inside the presidential office, maps were redrawn, not of borders but of priorities. Aid that once flowed into city centers was redirected to neglected provinces. Foreign contracts were reviewed line by line. Traoré demanded transparency, not as a performance but as a principle. And slowly, people began to believe that accountability was not a dream. It could live in the present. One evening, during a visit to a mountain village, Traoré met a boy who offered him a carved wooden bird. "It flies high," the child said, "but it remembers the ground." Traoré smiled and accepted the gift, saying only, "That is how we must lead." It was a simple exchange, unrecorded, unnoticed by the world, but it captured the soul of what was happening. A rise without arrogance, a rise with memory. As night fell once more over Burkina Faso, and the winds carried the scent of dust and change, Traoré sat beneath a tree older than any government. He listened to the crickets, to the distant laughter of children, to the silence of a country, slowly healing, and in that silence there was no fear. There was only the steady pulse of something sacred, a people reclaiming their future, one choice at a time. As the season changed and the heat gave way to softer winds, the transformation in Burkina Faso was no longer only visible, it was palpable. Markets bustled with more confidence, schools buzzed with new questions, elders walked with dignity, knowing their stories were being honored, not forgotten. It was as if the very soil of the country had exhaled, releasing decades of quiet frustration and drawing in the breath of renewal. International press eventually moved on, chasing the next crisis, the next controversy. But those who had truly paid attention understood something deeper. Traoré had not acted for the cameras, he had acted for history. His rejection of the deal had not been a moment of pride. It had been a mirror, forcing the world to confront how easily it confused aid with authority and help with control. In a small church near the border, an old priest delivered a sermon about truth. He told the story of a shepherd who refused a robe of gold, choosing instead to walk barefoot with his people. The congregation nodded slowly, understanding the parable without explanation. They had lived under leaders who wore fine robes but never walked beside them. Now they followed a man who wore dust on his boots. In Europe, some policymakers tried to minimize the ripple effect. They called it symbolic. They said Burkina Faso was too small to matter, but behind closed doors, strategies shifted, new approaches were drafted, diplomats were warned to tread more carefully. And think tanks quietly acknowledged that something irreversible had occurred, not a revolution of weapons, but a revolution of expectations. Traoré, meanwhile, continued his quiet path. He declined awards, he avoided summits, unless absolutely necessary. He preferred town halls and farms to red carpets and podiums. His philosophy was simple. Power meant proximity to the people, not ruling from above but standing among. And that nearness created something far stronger than authority. It created belief. In classrooms, children no longer looked to the West when asked who inspired them. They named local nurses, farmers, and sometimes the man who had said no on live television. Their essays reflected dreams rooted in home. Their drawings showed villages thriving. Hope, once abstract, had become visible. Not because a miracle had arrived, but because someone had dared to say, "We are enough." As stars appeared once more in the night sky, Ibrahim Traoré stood near the window of his modest office. A single lamp lit the desk behind him, filled with reports and handwritten letters. Outside, the capital rested, and in the stillness he felt something rare, not triumph, not pride, but peace. The kind of peace that comes only when you have nothing left to prove, only something left to protect. Months after the televised rejection, the story still lingered, not as a headline but as a memory woven into daily life. In Burkina Faso, people stopped referring to it as the speech. They began calling it the turning. For them, it marked the moment their country stopped asking to be understood and began declaring who it was. And that subtle shift changed everything. In cities, murals remained untouched, preserved not by decree but by reverence. Children walked past them on their way to school, tracing the outlines of Traoré's silhouette with curious fingers. Parents no longer told them to dream of leaving. They encouraged them to stay and build. The land had not changed, the people had. And with that, even the harshest terrain began to feel fertile. Elsewhere in the world, critics faded into the background. Their voices, once loud, were drowned by the quiet determination of a people rising. Burkina Faso was not seeking validation. It was setting an example that dignity did not depend on wealth, that sovereignty was not a gift, and that leadership was not about pleasing everyone, but about standing for something greater than yourself. In one corner of the country, a retired schoolteacher wrote a letter to Traoré. She described how, for the first time in her life, she believed the future of her nation would not be decided in foreign rooms, but in village classrooms. She enclosed a photo of her final students, 12 boys and girls holding up hand-painted signs that read, "We are the next voice." Traoré received the letter. He read it twice. Inside the office, surrounded by silence, he pinned the photo beside his desk, not to admire it, but to remind himself why he started. For him, the greatest measure of success was not international praise, but generational continuation. If the next leaders could speak with the same clarity, the same courage, then his work would live beyond him. In every province, echoes of the original moment still stirred. The rejection was no longer remembered as defiance. It was remembered as declaration, a single, still moment that told an entire world, "We know who we are." And from that moment on, nothing could ever be the same. Not in Burkina Faso, not in the minds of those who had watched and remembered. And somewhere in the highlands, as evening fell, an old drumbeat returned. The same rhythm that had echoed for generations, long before cameras and microphones, long before presidents and summits. It beat not for war, not for fame, but for truth, and the people danced to it, because it belonged to them, just like their future. Time passed, but the story never faded. It became a part of the land, like the rivers that cut through dry plains, or the wind that carried voices across distant hills. In every corner of Burkina Faso, people told the tale not as a speech, but as a beginning. A moment when one man reminded the world that silence does not mean surrender, and that respect, once reclaimed, cannot be taken back. The fields continued to grow. The cities continued to stretch. Life remained difficult, but it was no longer defined by struggle alone. It was now marked by possibility. Possibility rooted in truth, in leadership, and in the idea that dignity could not be negotiated away. That moment on live television had not simply rejected a deal. It had planted a flag in the soul of a nation. And though the cameras were long gone, and the news cycle had moved on, the people remembered. They remembered the pause, the calm refusal, the quiet certainty. They remembered that the world had offered a bargain, and their leader had offered something greater, a mirror, a voice, and a path forward with pride. In a quiet home near the Ghanaian border, an old woman stirred a pot of stew as her granddaughter asked, "Is it true he said no to a president?" The woman smiled. "He said yes," she whispered, "to us." And in that sentence lived the essence of everything Traore had done, not opposition for the sake of conflict, but allegiance to something deeper, the people who had trusted him to lead. Today his name is still spoken not in chants but in conversations, not in slogans but in stories passed from one generation to the next. And those stories are not about power, they are about posture, about standing when it would have been easier to bend, about choosing roots over rewards, about building something that no agreement, no camera, and no president could ever erase. The world may not understand it fully. They may analyze, critique, and speculate, but those who lived it, who watched it unfold in real time, know what they saw. They saw a man stand, unshaken, a nation listen, unbroken, and a new chapter begin unwritten by others. So if you believe in that vision, if you believe in leaders who serve with truth, in nations that rise with dignity, and in the future of a strong, united Africa, then subscribe to this channel, a channel that stands with Ibrahim Traoré and with the rise of a new Africa.